My name is Laura Johnson, and I'm a resident of the Old Mission Peninsula. A couple of things that I found out is that you can't just do the history of the Mission Point Light. You can't even do just the history of the Old Mission Peninsula, because we found out that it's all interconnected. It's interwoven with the regional history, and national history, and world history.
Anin, Nimkis Dishnakash, Makadeva Ingando Modawa Nishinaabe. I said, hello, my name is Thunder, and I'm from the Odawa people, who is part of the 3 tribes that comprise the Council of 3 Fires. That's the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribes. These 3 tribes had their origins on the East Coast. Anthropologists figure that we moved over here probably around 1100, 1200.
If one thinks back to 1830, one has to visualize that the whole Northwest region, and that includes all of the land from Grand Rapids north, even into the UP, with the exception of Mackinac Island and Sault Ste. Marie. This whole region was wooded territory. The explorers, the fur trappers were here certainly, and Indians had been here for hundreds of years. It's important to think about the 1839-1840 years, the winter in particular. At that point in time, there was obviously the Reverend Peter Doherty, but also there was Peter Greenlee, who was the Indian interpreter, Isaac George, who was the blacksmith that Henry Schoolcraft brought to the peninsula, and John Johnson, who was the government farmer. They were here 1839, 1840, and then in 1841, 2 additional people arrived. There was George Johnson, who was the government carpenter, and Henry Bradley, the teacher. The Treaty of Washington also provided for $5,000 annually for educational tools that were used for practical applications, such as farming, blacksmithing, construction, and $3,000 annually to support missions.
By 1836, all of the prime fur-bearing species in the ceded territory were on their last legs. In fact, by 1836, the fur trade had been unpopular, or had been unprofitable for quite a number of years. But the traders kept advancing goods, traps, guns to the Indians. The American Fur Company stuck in there. Why? Because they knew that the government allowed the Indians in the United States to put into treaties a fund that would pay Indian debts. It's called a debt fund. That was it. That was the only way.
The Treaty of Washington, besides giving up the 14 million acres, the Native Americans giving up the 14 million acres, also provided $30,000 that was to be shared by about 6,500 Native Americans, 10 times that amount for the alleged debt that they owed traders. Chief Agosa, who had a Indian Native American tribe in the northeast corner of the now Old Mission Peninsula, really wanted Doherty to build his mission at that particular point and his school. The Deepwater Harbor gave them good protection, good access, so Doherty moved from what is now Elk Rapids over to this protected bay on the Old Mission Peninsula. In 1842, Doherty completed the first frame home in the greater Grand Traverse region. It was a story and a half. It's still in existence, and this is the home that the Peter Doherty Society is restoring. It came before Traverse City, before any of the other outlying areas, Elk Rapids, Petoskey, Sutton's Bay, Northport, and even down the western shore of the state of Michigan. The impact of Doherty is certainly significant. By 1851, there were approximately 40 buildings in what is now Old Mission. Now, one of the things that we have to go back to is the Treaty of Washington. When the land was sold, the government designated certain regions of this newly acquired 14 million acres to be Indian reservations. And the 18-mile peninsula that jutted out in the Traverse City Bay area, separating it into East Bay and West Bay, was designated as a temporary reservation for the Native Americans. This basically said that they could live there, but they couldn't own the land. Doherty was taking some of this annual allocation coming out of the Treaty of Washington, saving it for the Native Americans in this region, and hopefully at a particular point in time would be able to use these accumulated funds to buy land. This happened in 1851, where they were given the opportunity to purchase land in what is now Omina. There was a clause in one of the changes in the Michigan Constitution that said that Native Americans could own land if they were citizens, and to become a citizen they had to renounce their tribal relationship. Chief Fagosa and several of his band decided to do this. Others rejected that notion and migrated to Canada. In 1852, as I mentioned before, they did move to Omina, bought land, and Doherty went with them and created a new church, a new mission. At that point, this area, his original mission, was called the Old Mission. Also of significance with Doherty and Henry Schoolcraft was their treatment of the Native Americans. It was a wonderful relationship that exhibited the ability to commingle with both Native Americans and Western Europeans. And I think Doherty's insight, along with Schoolcraft's in this area, are significant to the treatment of Indians in northwestern Michigan.
And so we have always been pretty much open and acceptable to other peoples. And so this area here in this region got known for that early on. We didn't have the major wars that took place on the East Coast and later on out in the Midwest. So in 1830 they began the great experiment called the Indian Removal Act. And they began to remove Indians from here to the west. But the threat of removal always hung over everyone's head, and that's why Peter Doherty and the Smiths, other groups, protected the Indian people. Those who were members of their congregations received their protection.
My name is Tim Carroll. I was born on the Peninsula on March the 29th, 1939, or Munson Hospital, rather, and come from a pioneering family. All four sets of my 8 great-grandparents came to Michigan, rolled up into Traverse City in the 1850s. I was born on a cherry farm on the Old Mission Peninsula and spent the first 17 years of my life going to Mapleton, the one-room schoolhouse, the only one on the peninsula that's actually burnt to the ground. The rest of them have all been converted into homes. But in 1973, Mapleton, which is at the corner of Seven Hills Road and Devil's Dive, burnt and that was replaced by a single-family house. So the only thing left is the flagpole. But I had my first 7 years of education there. But I came back and I have restored my great-grandfather's house. That's great-grandfather Johnson's house. And I'm sitting in a bedroom of that house. And I'm surrounded by all the pictures of all 8 of my great-grandparents. So with your patience, I will take you through a little story about each of them. My mother was a Wilhelm. They were a merchant class in Traverse City, but also they had farms. They all came over on a single ship called the Herrenzollern von Oltenburg, which is in English the Archduchess of Altenburg. It was a two-masted sailing ship. John Wilhelm, the brother of my great-great-grandfather, came to America first and wrote one letter back to his village, which was now the outskirts of Prague, and said, "America is terrific, why don't you come?" And there must have been more than one letter pass hands, but in 1854, 80 people, made up of several families, quietly sold their possessions, and by night left their villages, or they're indentured, they're probably indentured to some kind of nobleman, and made their way to the harbor at Bremenhaven. A manuscript has survived from that trip that was written by a 77-year-old merchant in Traverse City, Mr. Prikop, who was a 10-year-old boy on that transatlantic voyage. It's a wonderful memoir of the 54 days at sea in a wooden ship. All 80 of these folks that were known to each other were the only passengers. It was a very small wooden ship, sailing ship. And the mothers were given the food by the ship owners, and then they had to cook it on wood ranges below the deck. There were 4 wood ranges set in a row, and then bunks along the side, 3 deep, 3 high. And the reminiscences are just wonderful. But they all rolled up into New York Harbor on the 18th of December, 1854. And John Wilhelm was supposed to be meeting them at the docks, and he wasn't there, and 80 people milling around. And finally, everything was resolved, and they always had planned to move to Chicago on the train from New York, because that was where there was a large Bohemian settlement. And then from there, the men came up to Traverse City because you could work 2 winters in the lumber camps, and there were steamers, of course, going back and forth all the time from Chicago. So the wives would come up in the spring and meet the men who, in the lumber camp, you stayed there the whole time. You were fed and clothed, and you were given your sum of money at the very end of the winter. And the wives would be there to collect the money, so it didn't go for drink. And 2 winters in the lumber camps would give you enough money to buy 40 acres of land, or thereabouts. So that was really the way that many of the European settlers came here, and the sort of economics behind their settling. My great-grandfather is actually the son of Anton and Johanna Wilhelm, who were on the boat. He was born, my great-grandfather, after they got to Traverse City. And they had about 800 acres of wonderful farmland, which is now on 31 South, as you go up that last hill, the sort of that whole flat land before you get to Chum's Corners. And had beautiful large Victorian houses, one of which is pictured in the book of the historian,
Wakefield.
Lawrence Wakefield, thank you, did, which was owned by my grandmother and grandfather. But anyway, Henry here in the picture was betrothed to and married a nice Bohemian girl, again from the Chicago families. Those families always came up here in the summer from the earliest times. I mean, even the 1850s, when Traverse City was barely 10 years old, they would come and spend their summers and eat the good food and live their fresh life and go back to Chicago. She was a Pomazelle, and her uncle was a professional tailor. So her wedding outfits and her traveling dress and a few other things have survived, and we've donated them to the Historic Society. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest boy, Adolf Wilhelm, was my grandfather, and his senior class book survives from Central High School. There were 18 students in senior class in Central High. I think it was in 1899 and 1900. And 3 of them were Wilhelms. because the tribe really did enlarge, and there was Emanuel Wilhelm, who was the mayor. There, Charlie Wilhelm built the Opera House. There was the Tony Wilhelm, my great-grandfather's brother, had what they called the Wilhelm department store on the corner of 8th and Union. And but then there was a second brother lived across the road from my grandfather. His name was Willard Wilhelm, and there was a sister Lillian, who was a beauty in her day, who never married, but did pursue a singing career, and we know for sure that at least once she was on the stage at the Metropolitan New York. A single playbill has survived with Miss Lillian Wilhelm in the chorus. But she had a nervous breakdown and came home and then lived in the old family house until she died in the 80s. My grandfather then married a Smoller girl from Chicago, and that is my other set of great-grandparents. If we can move to the left here a little bit. Let me put these two closer together. There. That's Carolyn Struta, whose two aunties, her mother's sisters, both married Traverse City businessmen, Mr. Peter Till and Mr. Martinick, and the Martinick Jewelers store is still there, although no longer owned. She too was a singer and a contralto, and very active in the Bohemian Cultural Center in Chicago. Again, a beauty in her day, and a personal friend of Madame Schumann Heint, who was quite a famous American opera singer, and who entertained Dvorak when he came through writing his New World Symphony. This is the husband. This is Charles Smoller, who came over as an engineer and did his early work in Traverse City. Now, they were not Traverse City residents after they were married, because he had an engineering job in Chicago, but of course. This is my grandmother Wilhelm's wedding picture. Now, this was in 1910, and it looks rather modern, but that was Chicago for you. They were married in Chicago before they moved back to Traverse City. And my mother was their firstborn daughter, and that Marie Norma Wilhelm. And so that is my mother's side of the family.
No,
We'll now go to my father's family.
It's better
And
here.
I'll just, because I live in the house that they built in 1864 or 65 after they had received a land grant during the administration of Abraham Lincoln. And this is a picture of the house that I live in today. In the foreground is Center Road, which is just a dirt track. And the house, except for the additional stone porch, is pretty much, looks just like that. Let me turn that. Those are the Carrolls. That is Edward Carroll and his wife Jane. Now, Edward's grandfather actually arrived in America. Edward's grandfather was named Peter Carroll. He was born as a son of a tenant farmer in County Louth, L-O-U-G-H, in Ireland. It's the six and their first children, and this is my father, Fred, playing on the floor of their first house. We still, that writing table of great-grandmothers is behind you, and I have my dictionary on the Bible stand, and we have that table as well. Carol's never threw much away. Anyway, here's a couple of shots of this little community in Mapleton. Before they took the lovely little tower off the church, it was rather sweet. That was something that happened in the 60s. This was the schoolhouse at Mapleton. By the time I went there in the 40s, it was a two-room schoolhouse. They just they left the central tower and just expanded both sides, so there were two rooms. This again is Center Road, just south of the church. That house is still there before you get to the town hall. And that's grandfather Carroll delivering mail early in his career. He would leave the post office in Traverse City. This was in the 1905, 1910 era. Leave the post office at 6, go out what is now Peninsula Drive until he got to the Mapleton store at noon. And the fellow from the old Mission post office, we'd meet him there, and they'd have a sandwich together at the general store at Mapleton, and then he'd go back Center Road and get back at 6 p.m. I'd like to share a few documents that we have, and we have copies of them for anybody who's interested. This is actually a deed to the property that I live on. It was given to my great-grandfather, Richard Johnson. Now, Richard Johnson arrived in Traverse City just about the time his father-in-law did. Now, his father-in-law was named Captain Samuel G. Rice and had some kind of little boat that carried people in freight, of which there were literally thousands. Before the railroads, the Great Lakes was an incredible transportation network. And of course, some of the impenetrable forests, for instance, trying to walk north in Michigan, those forests north of Saginaw were filled with mosquitoes and swamps, and even de Tocqueville turned around because he couldn't deal with it and took a boat. The deed is signed by Abraham Lincoln, since it was his administration, 160 acres still surround the property here, and deeded to Richard Johnson on the 14th of April, 1864. And interestingly enough, that is exactly 1 year to the day he died. It's a typical Michigan house with a one-bedroom downstairs for Mom and Dad, and then upstairs were 2 bedrooms, and the girls slept in one bedroom and the boys in another. It's a design that's replicated all through these early houses in the area. And it didn't matter if you had 2 sons and 2 daughters or 12 sons and 12 daughters, they managed to make do in those rooms and grew up to be healthy, worthwhile citizens. And I had the good luck of having a number of things from my great-grandmother Wilhelm's house, including the door on my left, which was the front door of her house, and it has a double glass, it has a etched glass drawing of an angel handing down a few cherries to a little girl holding her apron out. That etched glass is as thin as my fingernail, so I had it sandwiched in between some plate glass. The door is extra wide because you had to get the coffins